The fall on South Morgan Street. There's a specific kind of loneliness that only comes with money. Not the loneliness of an empty apartment or a Friday night with nowhere to go. Those are lonely in ways that any person can recognize and name. The loneliness I'm talking about is quieter and more corrosive than that. It's the loneliness of a man who has learned, through experience he paid dearly for, that every hand extended in his direction is reaching for something he owns. Arthur Vane had lived inside that loneliness for 4 years by the time he lowered himself onto the pavement of South Morgan Street on a Tuesday morning in October, arranged his left leg at a convincing angle, and waited to see what the world would do. He had chosen the spot deliberately. Not the magnificent mile, where tourists and their better instincts might tip the results. Not Lincoln Park, where joggers had earbuds in and a story to tell themselves about being late for something. Southside, near the bus stop at the corner of South Morgan and West 35th, where the neighborhood still had the texture of working-class Chicago, the cracked sidewalk squares, the smell of exhaust and fried food drifting from the corner diner, the pigeons that seemed to have accepted pavement as their permanent condition. If kindness still existed in this city, Arthur figured it would be somewhere in a place that hadn't yet been renovated into believing it was better than it was. He was wearing an old canvas jacket he'd found in the back of his coat closet, a pair of khaki trousers that had seen better decades, and shoes that his housekeeper Margaret had described as depressing. He had not shaved. He looked like a retired city employee who had fallen, which was exactly what he wanted to look like. His phone, the one his assistant Davis had pre-charged to 18% to make the scenario more convincing, was in his left breast pocket. His wallet contained $40 in small bills and a single credit card tucked beneath a folded piece of paper he always kept there. Though on this particular morning, the paper was simply the receipt from a gas station 2 blocks away. The first 7 minutes were instructive. 3 people walked past without slowing. A woman in scrubs glanced at him, hesitated for exactly 2 seconds, he counted, and then continued at the same pace, her lanyard swinging. A man in a delivery uniform crossed to the opposite side of the street at an angle so deliberate it could only have been intentional. A pair of teenagers on bikes arced wide around him like he was a pothole, and one of them said something the other laughed at. Arthur lay on the pavement and felt the cold of it seeping through his jacket and thought, yes, this is what I expected. This is the confirmation of what I already know. He had run this test twice before, years ago, in different cities, and both times the results had been the same. He had never decided what he planned to do with the information. He just needed, periodically, to know that his understanding of the world was still accurate, that the walls he had built were built for reasons that still held. He was beginning to plan how he would get up without drawing attention, when he heard the sound of a bicycle chain skipping over a gear, the specific, off-rhythm sound of a bike that needed maintenance badly, and then the squeak of worn brakes, and then silence. Hey, mister. Arthur didn't look up immediately. Part of him, the part that had sat in negotiating rooms for 40 years, waited a beat before responding. He turned his head slowly. The boy was maybe 10 or 11, small for whatever age he was, with the kind of face that looked like it had already learned to be older than its body. Dark eyes set wide beneath a forehead that was creased, slightly, in the way of someone thinking through a problem. He was wearing a grey hoodie that was 2 sizes too large, jeans with a tear across the left knee that was not a fashion choice, and sneakers so worn at the toe that the white rubber underneath showed through like bone. He had a canvas bag over one shoulder, the kind with a shoulder strap, and it was fat with newspapers. He was a delivery boy, or a street vendor. Either way, he was someone whose morning had a job in it. "You okay?" the boy said. He was still straddling the bike, one foot on the ground, the other on the pedal, the posture of someone who had not yet decided whether to stay or go. His eyes were moving over Arthur the way a person looks at something when they are trying to determine if it is an emergency or simply a problem. "I fell," Arthur said. He made his voice rough with the appropriate amount of pain. "My leg, I think I twisted it." The boy set the kickstand. The bike wobbled and almost fell, and the boy caught it with one hand and pressed the stand down harder with his foot. And then he crouched down beside Arthur. He didn't touch him. He looked at the leg, then at Arthur's face, then back at the leg. "Can you move it?" he asked. "Not well," Arthur said. "I dropped my phone somewhere. I can't find it." "Your phone's in your pocket," the boy said, looking directly at the outline of the device through the canvas jacket fabric. His voice was not accusatory. It was simply accurate. Arthur almost smiled, despite himself. "Battery's dead," Arthur said. The boy looked at him for a moment longer. Then he stood up, unshouldered his bag, set it against the wall of the building behind them, and looked up and down the block. His gaze settled on the payphone at the far end of the block. An actual payphone, one of the few remaining ones the city had not yet removed, planted there with the indifference of municipal infrastructure. He reached into the front pocket of his jeans and pulled out a small, folded amount of money, a few ones, some quarters. He counted it with the focus of someone for whom the counting mattered. Then he looked back at Arthur. "I'm going to call 911, he said. It was not a question. "Don't try to move." "You don't have to do that," Arthur said. He said it the way a person in mild pain says things, slowly, with effort. But he was watching the boy now, with an attention he hadn't felt in some time. "Yeah, I kind of do," the boy said, already moving toward the payphone. "That's just, you're on the ground, mister." Arthur watched him go. The boy fed quarters into the slot with practiced efficiency. He didn't fumble, didn't have to count twice, and dialed. Arthur could not hear what he said from this distance, but he watched the boy's posture during the call. Straight, calm, giving information in the clipped way of someone who had called emergency services before or had been told how. When he finished, he hung up and walked back at the same unhurried pace he'd used going there. He retrieved his bag from against the wall and crouched back down beside Arthur. "They're coming," he said. "Maybe 8 minutes." "Thank you," Arthur said. The boy nodded. He sat on the edge of the curb, not on the pavement with Arthur, but close, and rested his arms on his knees. They sat in silence for a moment. The morning moved around them. A bus wheezed past. A dog barked from behind a fence 2 houses down. The pigeons relocated by a few feet and then relocated back. "What's your name?" Arthur asked. The boy considered this. Not with suspicion exactly, but with the slight pause of someone who has learned that information has a cost. "Marcus," he said. "I'm Arthur." Marcus nodded, like this was information that had been provided and received. "You deliver papers?" Arthur asked. "Yeah, 3 mornings a week, and Saturdays I sell at the bus station." "How old are you?" 11. He said it without pride or complaint, just as a number. A woman with a stroller walked by on the other side of the street. She glanced at them, slowed, looked as though she might cross, and then the stroller's wheel caught a crack, and she bent to fix it and then kept walking. Marcus watched her go without expression. "People don't really stop," Marcus said. Not bitterly, not as a commentary, just as a thing he had noticed. "No," Arthur agreed. "They don't." "My mum says it's not because they're bad people," Marcus said. "She says they're just scared of getting it wrong. Like, what if they try to help and make it worse? So they do nothing instead." He paused. "I don't really agree with her, but she's usually right about stuff, so." Arthur looked at this boy sitting on the curb beside a stranger on the ground on a Tuesday morning in October, with newspaper ink on his fingers and a hole in his left sneaker, and he felt something he had not felt in a long time. He could not have named it precisely. It was somewhere between recognition and grief. The ambulance arrived in 6 minutes. Marcus stood when he heard the siren, and when the paramedics came out and crouched over Arthur, with their equipment and their professional calm, the boys stepped back and gave them room. Arthur let them do their initial assessment. He had already decided he would come clean at the hospital, tell them it was a wellness experiment, accept whatever paperwork embarrassment that entailed. But before they moved him, he looked over at Marcus. The boy was retrieving his bag from the wall. He was getting ready to leave. "Marcus," Arthur said. The boy stopped and looked at him. "Thank you," Arthur said again. "I mean it." Marcus looked at him for a moment with those wide, already older than 11 eyes. Then he nodded once, a small, serious nod, the kind that means "I heard you" rather than "you're welcome," and got back on his bike. As the paramedics helped Arthur onto the stretcher, one of them, a young woman named Rita, whose name tag he would remember, said, "Lucky that kid was around. He gave a good description of your location. Very calm for his age." "Yes," Arthur said, "he was." He reached into his jacket pocket, where he'd felt something shift when he'd been moved. A piece of paper, small, folded once. He didn't remember putting it there. He unfolded it on the stretcher as the ambulance doors closed. It was written in pencil, in the careful, slightly lopsided print of a child who had learned to write in school and practiced it earnestly. "I hope you feel better, mister. Nobody should be alone on the ground." Arthur read it twice, then he folded it again, carefully, and put it back in his pocket. There's a detail worth sitting with here. That note wasn't a ticket, wasn't a business card, wasn't a way of asking for anything in return. It was the kind of thing a person writes when they want someone to know they were seen. Not as a problem to solve, but as a person who deserved better than lying alone on cold concrete. Arthur Vane had received a great many things in his life. Awards, contracts, handshakes that meant millions of dollars. He had received a eulogy for his wife that reduced a room full of hard men to tears. But in 40-some years, he had not once received a note from someone who wanted nothing from him except for him to feel better. He lay in the back of the ambulance and held that knowledge very still. The way you hold something fragile when you are not sure yet if you have the right to keep it. At the hospital, the process of coming clean took less time than Arthur expected. He told the attending physician, a tired man named Dr. Okafor, who had seen stranger things, that he had faked the fall as a personal experiment, that his leg was fine, that he was sorry for the misuse of resources. Dr. Okafor ordered an X-ray anyway, on the grounds that 74-year-old men who spend time on cold pavement should not be trusted to assess their own structural integrity, and the X-ray confirmed nothing was broken. Arthur was given a cup of coffee he didn't ask for, and a pamphlet on fall prevention he tucked into his jacket pocket beside the folded note. His assistant, Davis, picked him up at noon. Davis was 41, efficient, and had worked for Arthur for 11 years, which meant he had learned to drive without asking questions when his employer was being cryptic about the nature of his whereabouts. On the drive back to the house in Hyde Park, Arthur looked out the window at the city moving past. "Davis," he said. "Sir, there's a boy, 11 years old. He sells newspapers near the bus station at South Morgan and 35th. His name is Marcus. I want to know who he is, who his family is, where he goes to school, whether there's anything unusual about his situation. I want to know discreetly. Don't approach him. Don't talk to anyone who would talk to him." Davis, whose expression in the rearview mirror did not change by so much as a millimeter, said, "Timeline?" "A week," Arthur said. 2 at the outside. All right. They drove the rest of the way in silence. When they pulled into the driveway of the house, Arthur sat for a moment before getting out. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out the folded note again. The pencil was smudged slightly at the edges, from the pavement probably, or from being carried in a pocket pressed against a grown man's chest for the better part of a morning. The handwriting was earnest and slightly too large, the way children's writing is when they are still building the habit of it. Nobody should be alone on the ground. Arthur thought about Derek. He thought about the 3 months he'd spent in a hospital bed 4 years ago after the car accident on I-90, with 2 broken ribs and a fractured collarbone, and a nurse who brought him orange jello every afternoon, with the cheerfulness of someone who had decided orange jello was the answer to most of life's difficulties. He thought about the bouquet of white orchids that had arrived on the 3rd day, with a card that said, "Get well soon, Dad. Closing the Copenhagen deal this week. Back stateside by the 15th. He thought about how he had read that card and felt something in him. Something he couldn't name then, and still couldn't name exactly. Go very quiet. Nobody should be alone on the ground. He put the note back in his pocket and went inside. Margaret was in the kitchen, making the soup she made every Tuesday, regardless of the season. The house smelled like thyme and bay leaves. Arthur hung his jacket, carefully, on the hook by the door. "You look like you fell down," Margaret said, without turning from the stove. "I did," Arthur said. "On purpose?" He paused. "Partly." Margaret turned then and looked at him with the particular expression she reserved for moments when Arthur was being more complicated than the situation required. She had worked for him for 19 years and had known his wife Eleanor before that, and she was one of perhaps 2 people in the world who could look at Arthur Vane without the slight adjustment of posture that money tends to produce in people. "Soup will be ready in 20 minutes, she said. "Thank you, Margaret." He went upstairs. He took the note out of his jacket before he hung it in the closet and set it on the edge of his desk. He sat in the chair by the window and looked at it across the room. He stayed there for a long time. The boy who didn't come back. Davis's report came back in 8 days, and Arthur read it at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold beside him. Marcus Antoine Webb, 11 years old, 5th grade at Henderson Elementary on South Halstead. His father, James Webb, had died of a heart attack 31 months ago at age 38. The kind of statistic that landed in a report like a stone dropped in still water. His mother, Diane Webb, 36, had been working as a home health aide until 14 months ago, when she had been diagnosed with a form of lupus that had made the physical demands of the job impossible to sustain consistently. She currently worked part-time at a laundromat on West 26th when her health allowed. The family lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Pilsen, rent-assisted by a housing subsidy that covered a portion but not all of the monthly total. Marcus had been selling newspapers 3 mornings a week and Saturdays at the bus terminal since the previous spring. He had a perfect attendance record at Henderson for the current year. His 5th grade teacher, a Ms. Nora Calloway, had written in a school report. Davis had obtained this through the kind of discreet channel that cost more than it should. That Marcus was exceptionally capable, reads 2 grade levels above his class, occasionally stubborn when he believes he is being managed rather than taught. Arthur set the report down. He read that last line again. Occasionally stubborn when he believes he is being managed rather than taught. He had known men, senior partners, board members, heads of divisions, who he would have hired instantly based on that single character description. He also noted, as he refolded the report, that Davis had included a line at the bottom in his own handwriting. Davis occasionally editorialized in ink when he felt the documentation didn't tell the whole story. The phone call to 911 on October 14th. The boy's prepaid phone was out of minutes. He used quarters from his newspaper money. Estimated total spent, $1.75. That was all the change he had on him that morning. Arthur put the report in the desk drawer, where he kept things he wasn't ready to do anything about yet. He spent 2 more weeks doing nothing. This was not inaction. It was the careful patience of a man who had learned that the worst decisions he'd ever made were the ones he'd made quickly, in the flush of feeling something strongly. He had built a freight empire partly on the principle that the right moment to move was rarely the first moment you wanted to. Then, on a Thursday morning in late November, he put on the same canvas jacket and the same depressing shoes and took a cab to Pilsen. He found Marcus at the bus terminal at South Morgan, as the report said he would be on Thursdays. The boy was standing near the entrance with his canvas bag, holding up a copy of the Tribune toward a man in a suit who waved him off without slowing down. Marcus lowered the paper without any visible change in expression and turned to the next person. He was not performing optimism, he was simply working. Arthur bought a paper. Marcus looked up at him, recognized him after a half-second, a flicker of something crossing his face that might have been surprise, and said, 50 cents. I know, Arthur said, and gave him $1. Marcus reached into his pocket to make change. "Keep it," Arthur said. The boy looked at him. "I told you, keep it," Arthur said. "I wanted to come find you, to say thank you properly. You left before I could, at the hospital." "I wasn't at the hospital," Marcus said. "I know, but you made the call. The paramedic told me." Arthur paused. "She said you gave a very good description of the location." Marcus shrugged one shoulder, the gesture of someone receiving information they've decided not to do anything with. He was already turning slightly, scanning the flow of people from the terminal exit with the professional attention of someone who has learned that standing still is how you miss customers. "Can I buy you a coffee?" Arthur said. "Or whatever you'd like. Breakfast." Marcus looked at him with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was careful in the way of someone who has been taught, by experience rather than by instruction, that things offered for free tend to cost something eventually. "I'm working," he said. "I can wait." The boy considered this. Then he said, "I finish at 9. Arthur waited on a bench near the terminal entrance. He read his Tribune, the one he'd bought for 50 cents, which seemed, suddenly, to be the most valuable newspaper he had purchased in years. At 8:57, Marcus came to find him with his bag empty and his shoulders slightly lower from the release of carrying it. They walked to a diner 2 blocks away called the Blue Anchor, which had a sign in the window promising breakfast all day, no attitude, and slid into a booth near the back. Here is the part that stays with me, looking back on it. Arthur Vane had sat across the table from presidents of countries. He had negotiated with men whose net worth made his look modest. He had sat across from his son Derek in boardrooms and in hospital waiting rooms, and in the stiff chairs of an estate lawyer's office, and none of those conversations had made him feel as careful, as alert, as quietly responsible as sitting across from this small, watchful boy in a Chicago diner on a Thursday morning in November. Marcus ordered oatmeal with brown sugar, and then, when Arthur told him to order whatever he wanted, reconsidered and added scrambled eggs and toast. He ate without embarrassment but with focus, the focus of someone who is genuinely hungry rather than someone who is eating because the food is there. He answered Arthur's questions in the compact, accurate way he'd answered them on the curb. His school, his papers, his mother's health, the fact that he had a library card and currently had 3 books checked out. He did not ask Arthur anything in return for the first 15 minutes, which Arthur noticed. Most people, particularly people who know they are talking to someone wealthy, even when that person is deliberately dressed otherwise, ask questions designed to calibrate the situation. Marcus asked none. Then, at the end of his oatmeal, Marcus looked at him directly and said, "Why did you come find me?" "I told you to say thank you." "You said thank you at the ambulance." "I wanted to say it properly." Marcus looked at him for a moment. "People don't really do that," he said. "Do what?" "Come back to say thank you. They move on." He wasn't saying it with bitterness. He was saying it the way his mother might say the sky is grey in November, as a fact about the way the world runs, observed without resentment. Arthur looked at this boy and thought, "Your father is dead, your mother is sick. You spent your last quarters on a stranger. You didn't go into the hospital to see if he was okay. You left a note you never expected him to read. And here you sit telling me that people don't come back, as though it's a simple truth about meteorology." "I'm not most people," Arthur said. Marcus considered this. Then he said, "What do you do?" "I'm retired," Arthur said. "I used to run a company." "What kind?" "Trucks, moving freight, cargo." Marcus nodded. "My uncle drives a truck," he said. "Long haul, he's gone a lot." "It's that kind of work," Arthur said. They talked for another half hour. Arthur learned that Marcus's mother had studied nursing before she got sick, that Marcus wanted to be an engineer because he liked knowing how things were put together, that he had a notebook at home where he drew diagrams of mechanical things, engines, bridges, the gearing system of his bicycle, and wrote down questions about how they worked. He said this last part quietly, like it was something he didn't usually tell people, and then looked briefly at his empty plate, as if reconsidering whether he should have mentioned it. That's a good thing to have, Arthur said. Questions about how things work. Marcus looked up. My teacher says I should be in a better school, he said. She wrote it in my file. I saw the copy she gave my mum. What do your mother say about it? She says she's working on it. He paused. She's always working on it. Arthur paid the bill. When they walked out, Marcus slung his empty canvas bag back over one shoulder, and they stood on the sidewalk in the November cold. A bus went by. A woman pushed a cart with a squeaky wheel. The city made its ordinary Tuesday sounds. Can I come find you again? Arthur asked. Not to give you anything, just to talk. Marcus looked at him for a moment. The boy's eyes were doing that thing Arthur had noticed on the pavement, moving over him carefully, not suspiciously, but with the particular attention of someone who is trying to decide if something is real, or if it is a version of real constructed to look convincing. Okay, Marcus said finally. Thursdays are usually okay. He got on his bike and rode away, and Arthur stood on the sidewalk and watched him go until the grey hoodie disappeared around the corner. On the cab ride home, Arthur thought about Derek. Derek was 46. Derek lived in a condo in Gold Coast that Arthur had bought him, drove a car Arthur had co-signed for, and sat on the board of Vane Freight, now restructured into a holding company since Arthur's retirement, by virtue of being Arthur's son, and not by virtue of any particular genius for the work. Arthur loved his son in the way you love someone whose disappointments and your own are so entangled you can no longer tell which grief belongs to whom. He called Derek every Sunday. Derek answered about half the time. The conversations were careful and a little dry, like two people speaking a language they both know, but neither of them learned as children. That evening, Derek called on a Wednesday, which was unusual. He had heard from one of the board's junior members that Arthur had been picked up by an ambulance on the south side. He wanted to know what had happened. Arthur told him about the experiment, briefly, without the details that mattered. Derek was quiet for a moment and then said, in the controlled voice he used when he thought Arthur was being reckless, Dad, you're 74. You can't just lie down on sidewalks in the south side. I was testing something, Arthur said. Testing what? Whether anyone would stop. Another silence. Then Derek said, And did anyone? Yes, Arthur said. Good, Derek said. That's good. He paused. You should call Margaret if you're going to do things like that. Or Davis. You shouldn't be... Good night, Derek, Arthur said. He hung up and sat in the quiet of his study and looked at the tackboard above his desk, where Eleanor's photograph had lived since the year she died, 11 years ago now. She was laughing in the picture, caught mid-something at a party he couldn't remember the occasion of. In a red dress, he remembered exactly. He looked at her and thought about what she would have said about a boy called Marcus Webb, who had drawn diagrams of bicycle gears in a notebook and spent his last $2 calling help for a stranger. She would have said, Arthur, don't you dare waste this. He didn't. Thursdays became a fixture by December. By January, they had extended to include the occasional Saturday. Arthur would bring coffee, 2 cups, one with 3 sugars the way Marcus had ordered it at the Blue Anchor, and they would sit in the diner or, on warmer days, on a bench in the small park near the library on West 26th. Marcus remained watchful and a little guarded, the way he always was. But the guardedness was not hostility. It was the natural reticence of a boy who had not yet been given many reasons to lower it. And Arthur had decided, with a deliberateness he had applied to very few things in his personal life, that he was going to be patient until Marcus had enough reasons to feel otherwise. He met Diane Webb in February, at Marcus's suggestion. Marcus had told his mother about the old man from the street, and Diane, who was nothing if not thorough, had asked to meet him. She was thin in the way of people whose illness takes more than it returns, but she had Marcus's eyes, that same quality of careful, open attention, moving over Arthur with a look that assessed without performing assessment. She shook his hand firmly and offered him tea, and asked him, plainly and without embarrassment, what he wanted from her son. Nothing, Arthur said. He helped me. I wanted to know him. Diane Webb looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "That's the right answer. We'll see if it stays true." He liked her immediately and enormously. By the time spring arrived, Marcus had begun to talk about the notebook more freely, had shown Arthur a few of the diagrams, pages covered in mechanical drawings with labels and questions written in the margins. The boy's mind moved in the same way a good engineer's did, not in answers but in iterations, always asking what happens next, what breaks, what could be built better. Arthur had spent 50 years watching people think, and he knew, sitting in the Blue Anchor, looking at Marcus's drawings of a bicycle derailleur on a napkin, that this was a particular kind of intelligence that should not be wasted on newspaper routes. He said nothing about it yet. He filed it carefully in the part of himself that was still planning, still patient, and he ordered another coffee and let Marcus explain how the gears distributed load. It was during one of their Saturday meetings in April that Marcus let his guard drop in a way that surprised even him, Arthur thought. They had been sitting in the park for an hour, the city exhaling its first real warmth after months of grey cold, and Marcus had been quieter than usual. Arthur had not pushed. He had learned, was still learning, that with Marcus, silence was not an absence but a kind of speech, and that the right response to it was usually to wait rather than to fill it. Finally, Marcus said, "My mum had to go to the hospital last week, for 3 days." Arthur set his coffee cup down. "Is she okay?" "Yeah, she is now. She gets these flares sometimes. The doctors say it's manageable." He said manageable with the careful pronunciation of a boy who has heard a word used many times by adults and has learnt to use it without fully trusting it. "Were you alone?" Arthur asked. "My aunt came. She lives in Oak Park, so it's like an hour on the train. She stayed with me." He pulled at a thread on the knee of his jeans. The same jeans, Arthur noted, with the same tear in the same place, now slightly wider. "It was fine." "Okay," Arthur said. Marcus stopped, started again. "When she was in the hospital, I kept thinking..." He stopped again and looked at a pigeon that had landed nearby with the exaggerated interest of someone buying time to decide whether to say the next thing. "I kept thinking about when my dad died. He died at work, like he just fell down and then he didn't get up. And nobody called us for 3 hours because there was some problem with... I don't even know what. Some problem." He shook his head slightly. "And I just kept thinking, what if nobody calls? What if something happens and nobody calls?" The pigeon relocated. "Marcus," Arthur said, and the boy looked at him. "I would call." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. The look was complicated. It held doubt and something younger than doubt, something that wanted to believe this without yet having enough data to justify the belief. "You don't have our number," Marcus said. "Then give it to me," Arthur said, a beat. Marcus reached into his bag and tore the corner off a brown paper bag. From his lunch, which he had eaten earlier, a peanut butter sandwich and an apple, and wrote 7 digits on it with a pencil stub he found in the front pocket. He handed it to Arthur without ceremony. Arthur took it and put it in his shirt pocket, next to his heart, in the manner of a cliché that was entirely accidental and entirely accurate. There was something else that happened that spring. Arthur's son Derek, who had heard through Margaret, they had a relationship of civil, mutual surveillance, that Arthur was spending a lot of time with some kid in Pilsen, came for dinner in late April. He arrived in a cashmere coat and sat at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a glass of scotch he'd poured himself, and listened while Arthur gave him the version of events that was accurate, if incomplete. "A street kid," Derek said, not as a question. "His name is Marcus. He's 11 years old, and he's considerably smarter than most people I've sat across a table from." Derek smiled, the specific smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That's generous, Dad. It's an observation." "Right." He turned his glass in his hands. "You're not going to do something. Dad, you're not planning to get involved in this kid's situation financially, are you? Because..." "I'm helping him, Derek. He helped me. That's a simple transaction." Derek looked at him. "Nothing you do is simple." This was, Arthur thought, possibly the most accurate thing his son had said to him in years. He said, "Good night, Derek." Derek finished his scotch, stood, buttoned his cashmere coat. At the door, he paused and said, without turning around, "I just want you to be careful. People take advantage." "I know," Arthur said. "I've been studying the subject for quite a long time." The door closed. Arthur sat in the kitchen for a while after, listening to the house. He thought about what Derek's version of care sounded like. Be careful. People take advantage. He thought about what Marcus's version of care sounded like. Nobody should be alone on the ground. He thought that both of these things were true, and that the difference between them told you everything about the distances people learn to keep, and why. A signature in the dark. 3 years is a long time to watch someone become themselves. Arthur Vane was 74 the October he lay down on South Morgan Street. He was 77 when Marcus Webb turned 14 and won the citywide mathematics competition at the Chicago Public Schools qualifier. First place, by a margin that the moderator mentioned twice in the results letter, as if she wanted to make sure the committee understood she hadn't miscounted. Arthur heard about it on a Thursday, 3 days after it happened, when Marcus mentioned it in the same tone he might use to report the weather. Factual, slightly compressed, as though the information was available, but attention to it was optional. Arthur said, "You won." "Yeah," Marcus said. "Marcus, you won a city mathematics competition." "The problems weren't that hard," Marcus said, stirring his coffee. "The geometry section was easy. The algebra was a little annoying." Arthur looked at him across the table. The boy, he still thought of him as the boy, though Marcus was starting to develop the longer-limbed, sharper-jawed geography of who he was going to be, looked back with the patient expression he reserved for moments when Arthur was reacting to things that Marcus had already finished processing internally. "I'd like to do something," Arthur said, "for your win." "You don't have to," Marcus said. "I know I don't have to. I want to." There was a pause. Marcus looked at his coffee. "Can you come to my school? Miss Calloway's she's going to have a little ceremony thing, in the classroom. My mum can't make it because of her shift, and my aunt, she has the kids that day." Arthur was quiet for a beat. "Yes," he said. "I can come." Here's what I want you to notice about that exchange. Of all the things Marcus Webb could have asked for, and Arthur would have given him quite a lot, what he asked for was presence. Just someone to be there, a witness. That is what he had been missing most, Arthur later understood, and what Arthur himself had been missing in the years between Eleanor's death and a Tuesday morning in October 3 years ago, and perhaps what they had been quietly providing each other across a diner table every Thursday for the better part of 3 years. Arthur went to the ceremony. He sat in a plastic chair in the back of Ms. Calloway's 7th grade classroom. Calloway had moved with her students, the way some teachers do, the kind who are attached to their cohort rather than their grade, and watched Marcus receive a certificate and a handshake from the principal, and then a round of applause from the class that was enthusiastic and slightly embarrassed in the way middle school applause tends to be. Marcus stood with the certificate at his side and looked briefly at Arthur in the back of the room. And Arthur gave him a nod, small, precise, the nod that means, "I'm here, I see you, you did good." In the cab home, Arthur called Davis. "The Whitmore Scholarship," he said, "the one for Chicago area students entering private secondary schools. I want to know the application process, the timeline, and whether we can make a confidential contribution to the scholarship fund designated for students from Pilsen or Southside." "I'll find out today," Davis said. Good. This is the part of the story that Arthur did not tell Marcus, and did not tell Marcus for a long time. The scholarship arrived, officially through the Whitmore Foundation, with no Vane name attached to it, when Marcus was 13 and a half, 2 months before the application deadline for Whitney Young Magnet High School, which was the school Miss Calloway had been lobbying the family toward for 2 years. The scholarship covered 70% of the fees. Arthur quietly, through a second channel, A private donor fund managed by his estate lawyer, a meticulous woman named Sandra Park, covered the remaining 30% and a supplemental amount for materials and transportation. He also arranged, through the same fund, for Diane Webb's medical bills to be handled by a charitable health assistance program that matched her income profile. He reviewed the paperwork himself to make sure her name was not connected to his. He told no one. Not Davis, not Margaret, not even Eleanor's photograph on the wall, though he sat in front of it for a long time the night the first payment cleared. I want to pause here because people sometimes ask, when they hear this part of the story, why didn't he just tell them? Why the secrecy? The answer, I think, is that Arthur had spent 4 years being the man who lay down on pavement to test whether anyone would stop. He had spent his whole life in a world where giving and receiving were transactions, where charity was currency, where every kindness arrived with a price tag stitched to its lining. He was not yet completely sure that he was capable of giving without expecting to be witnessed giving. And until he was sure of that, until the thing he was doing was truly for Marcus and not for himself, not to be seen as the man who had done something generous, he didn't want the boy to know. He wanted to wait until the help was so thoroughly delivered that it could no longer be confused with performance. He was, at 77, still learning how to do this. Marcus started at Whitney Young in September. His first week, he called Arthur on a Thursday. They had exchanged numbers by now, a slow and slightly ceremonious development that had happened the previous winter, and reported, in the same compressed way he reported everything. The school's bigger than I thought. The math teacher's name is Mr. Herrera. He's okay. The homework's more than Henderson. A pause. I like it. Good, Arthur said. How'd I get the scholarship? Marcus asked. He asked it without accusation. With the same tone he asked questions about gearboxes and bridge load distribution. Curious, precise, wanting to understand the mechanism. Arthur said, "You have a math competition trophy and a teacher who wrote 3 recommendation letters. That's how you got it." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Okay." And they talked about Mr. Herrera's homework for the rest of the call. Arthur was not sure Marcus believed him entirely. But Marcus, like Arthur, had learned to wait for the right moment to pursue a thing. Diane Webb called Arthur in October of Marcus's first year at Whitney Young. It was a Sunday afternoon, and Arthur was reading in the study, and her voice on the phone had the sound of someone who has been composing what they want to say for some time. She told him, carefully and without specifics, that she knew. Not all of it. The scholarship fund was well obscured, but enough. The medical bills, the pattern of things that had improved at exactly the right moments. Arthur was quiet for a moment. "Are you angry?" he asked. "No," she said, and then, after a pause, "But I need you to know something. My son would have found a way. Without you. He would have found a way because that's what he does." "I know that," Arthur said. "That's why I helped him." There was a silence on the line. Then Diane Webb said, in a softer voice than she had been using, "Thank you, Mr. Vane." "Arthur," he said. "Arthur," she said. He held the phone for a moment after she hung up, and then he set it on his desk and looked out the window at the November grey street below, and felt something loosen in him, very slightly, like a cabinet door that has been stuck for years and is beginning, finally, to move. Meanwhile, Derek found out about Whitney Young. Not about Arthur's role in the scholarship, but about Marcus's enrollment in the school, through Margaret, who mentioned it without understanding the significance. Derek's response came in a Sunday phone call in November, in the controlled, careful voice he used when he had been considering what to say for several days and was afraid of what he might say if he let the control slip. "Dad," he said, "I want you to think about what you're doing, not the money. I know you'll say it's your money, and you're right, but it's the attachment. You're getting attached to this situation, to this family." Arthur said, "I'm aware of that. And you don't think that's potentially complicated? For them as much as for you? The kid is going to be what, 16, 17? And then he's going to go to college and build his life, and you're going to be... Derek stopped.
Old, Arthur suggested. A pause. I was going to say alone. Arthur looked out his study window. A woman was walking a dog on the sidewalk below, and the dog kept stopping to investigate cracks in the pavement, and the woman kept waiting with the patient, affectionate exasperation of someone who has decided the dog's interests matter. Derek, he said, when I was in the hospital 4 years ago, after the accident. The line went very quiet. I know, Derek said. You sent flowers. I know, Dad. I've told you. The Copenhagen deal was... I'm not saying this to wound you, Arthur said, and he meant it. This was the thing about the grief between them. It was not a wound that wanted to bleed. It was an old one that had scarred over and changed the shape of the tissue underneath. I'm saying it because I need you to understand why I think about attachment differently than you do. I spent 3 months in that hospital with very competent nurses and a lot of orange jello and the flowers you sent, and I learned something in there. I learned what alone feels like from the inside. And Marcus Webb, at 11 years old, with his father dead and his mother sick and $2 in his pocket, already knew that same thing and stopped for me anyway. The line was quiet for a long time. I know, Derek said finally. His voice was different. Something had shifted in it, a slight giving at the joints. I'm sorry, Dad, about the hospital. I know I said it before, but I'm sorry. I know you are, Arthur said. They talked for a few more minutes about ordinary things. Derek's work, a board matter, the weather, and hung up with the careful warmth they had both learned to sustain. But something had changed, slightly, in the molecular structure of that particular Sunday phone call, and Arthur sat in the silence after and noticed it. Then he reached into his desk drawer and took out the file he kept there. Not a formal file, just a folder where he had placed, over the years, small things. The torn corner of a brown paper bag with Marcus's phone number, a copy of the math competition results letter, a printout of Marcus's Whitney Young enrollment confirmation, and underneath all of it, in the back of the folder, where he had placed it the day he came home from the hospital on South Morgan Street, the original note. I hope you feel better, mister. Nobody should be alone on the ground. He read it as he sometimes did. The pencil was faded now at the edges. He had not refolded it any differently than Marcus had folded it. He kept it exactly as it had been. He filed the other papers back in the folder and closed the drawer. Then he picked up the phone and called Sandra Park. I'd like to schedule a meeting, he said, about the estate documents. I want to revisit some of the distribution terms. Of course, Sandra said. I can get you in next Wednesday. Good, Arthur said. He paused. Sandra, there may be some substantial revisions. Clear your afternoon. There was a short silence on Sandra's end, the kind that contains a great deal of professional understanding. I'll clear the whole afternoon, she said. He did not sign anything that day. He was not ready yet. But he had begun, in the quiet, methodical way he had always begun the things that mattered, to build the shape of what he wanted the future to look like. This was Arthur Vane at 77. Still careful, still planning, still learning how to give without the need to be seen giving. Still carrying a folded piece of paper in the back of a file drawer. Still not entirely sure, but closer than he had been, that the world contained more than he had been willing to believe for the better part of a decade. There was one more thing that happened in this stretch of years that has to be told, because it was the moment Marcus came closest to losing the thing that made him who he was. And Arthur's response to it was the second thing, after the note, that I think mattered most. Marcus was 14 when a boy named Calvin from his old neighborhood, a year older, already enmeshed in the low-level operations that run along the edges of Southside blocks, started coming around. Calvin was not a villain of the cartoon variety. He was a kid who had done the math and concluded, accurately, that the options available to boys like him and Marcus were fewer and slower than the effort required to pursue them legitimately. He offered Marcus a delivery job that paid 3 times what the newspaper route paid, required 2 afternoons a week, and was structured in the way such offers are always structured, vague at the edges, specific about the money. Marcus did not say yes and did not say no. He carried it for 3 weeks. He told Arthur about it on a Thursday. Not everything. He told Arthur there was a job offer from a guy I know, and described it in terms that were accurate but slightly sideways, the way a person describes something when they want the other person to hear what they are not quite saying. Arthur listened to all of it. Then he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you think the job actually is?" Marcus looked at his coffee. "I think I know what it probably is." "And what's stopping you?" Marcus was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the Blue Anchor's ambient noise, the clatter of dishes, a conversation 2 booths over, the bell on the door, filled the space between them. "My mum," Marcus said finally. "If she found out, it would make her sick again, like actually sick again." Arthur said, "And outside of your mum?" Another silence. "I don't want to be someone who does that," Marcus said quietly. "I already know I don't want to be that. The money's real," Arthur said. "And it would make things easier in ways that matter. I know that." "Yeah. But you already know what you want to say to Calvin." Marcus looked up at him. "Yeah," he said. "Then say it," Arthur said. "And if things get harder before they get better, you call me. That's what the number's for." Marcus said Calvin's name one more time across a table a week later and said no, and that was the end of it in the way these things are sometimes. Not dramatically, but with the quiet, costly finality of a door closing. It cost Marcus the social ease that came with knowing Calvin, cost him a certain kind of belonging that still mattered at 14, even when you had decided you didn't want what it required. He was quieter than usual for a month afterward, but he did not change direction. Arthur watched this and said nothing, and understood something he had been approaching for 3 years. This boy would have been fine without him. Was fine. Would continue to be fine. The help Arthur had offered was real and had mattered, but it was not the source of what Marcus was. What Marcus was had been there on a curb in October when an old man was lying on the ground, long before Arthur had found him. And that, the recognition of that, was when Arthur went back to Sandra Park's office and actually signed the papers. What the nurse remembered. Arthur Vane was 78 years old on the March night the ambulance came again. This time, not because he had asked for it, but because Margaret had found him at the kitchen table, with his hand pressed to his chest and the colour of someone who had been drained of something important. She called 911 before she called Davis, and she did not tell Derek until the next morning, which Arthur, when he found out, considered one of the best decisions Margaret had made in 19 years of employment. The cardiology team at Northwestern Memorial described what had happened as a mild myocardial infarction. Mild being a clinical modifier that means not the kind that kills you on the spot, not unconcerning, and kept him for 4 days from monitoring and the recalibration of medications he should have been managing more attentively for the past 2 years. He had a private room on the 6th floor with a window that looked east toward the lake, invisible behind buildings but present in the quality of the light. He was told to rest. He rested in the way he did everything, partially. On the second day, Marcus came. He was 17 by now and had grown into something that combined his mother's careful attention with a ranginess of posture that was entirely his own. He moved through rooms as though he was already calculating the load-bearing properties of the walls. He sat in the chair beside Arthur's bed and looked at him with the particular expression he had been using since he was 11, the one that assessed without flinching and offered nothing it wasn't prepared to stand behind. "You look terrible," Marcus said. "That's a reasonable observation," Arthur said. "You weren't taking your blood pressure medication." "How do you know that?" "Margaret told me," Marcus said, with a slight smile of someone who is not above coalition. Arthur looked at him. The light from the east window caught the side of the boy's face, young man's face, and Arthur thought, Eleanor would have loved you. "I'm fine," Arthur said. "You're in a hospital bed for the second time in 4 years," Marcus said. "So? The first time was my own idea, right?" Marcus looked at him steadily.
Mr. Vane, Arthur, I need you to take your medication. The bluntness of this, delivered without hedging, without apology, in the voice of someone who has decided that the relationship permits the truth, made Arthur feel something catch in his chest that had nothing to do with the infarction.
All right, Arthur said.
Good. Marcus sat back. My mum says she'll call Margaret every week to check. Arthur blinked. Did you ask her to do that? No, Marcus said. She volunteered. There's a moment I keep coming back to in this story, and it's this one. Arthur Vane, 78 years old, lying in a hospital bed, being told by a 17-year-old boy and his sick mother, a woman who had her own medications to manage and her own hard mornings, that they had put a system in place to make sure he was taking care of himself. Nobody had asked them to. Nobody had suggested it would be appropriate. They had simply done it in the quiet, practical way of people who decide that someone matters and then act accordingly. He didn't thank Marcus in the moment. He wasn't sure he had the right words. He nodded, the small, precise nod he had used in the back of Miss Calloway's classroom years ago. The one that meant, I'm here, I see you, you did good. And Marcus received it with his own nod, the one that meant, I heard you, that's enough. On the third day of his hospital stay, Arthur did what he had been putting off for 3 years. He asked Davis to pull the admissions records from his October hospitalization, the original one from South Morgan Street. He had the date, the ambulance unit number, the receiving facility. It had been a different hospital, but the paperwork was traceable. He asked Davis to find the nurse who had been on duty in the intake bay. He did not say why. Davis came back the next morning with a name, Ruth Esparza, RN, currently still employed at the hospital, working the morning shift. Arthur was discharged on a Thursday. On Friday, he called the hospital directly and asked to speak with Ruth Esparza. The woman who picked up was brisk and warm in the way of people who do difficult work and have made their peace with its demands. He told her who he was, the man from South Morgan Street, October 4 years ago, the fall. He explained, briefly, that he had been looking for information about what had happened that morning, specifically about the boy who had called the ambulance. A pause on the other end of the line. The kid with the newspapers, Ruth said. Yes, I remember him, she said. Her voice shifted slightly, the way people's voices do when they move from professional mode into something more personal. It was a busy morning, we had a lot coming in, but he stuck with me. I remember he was still there when we moved you inside, standing in the waiting area, not asking to come in, just standing there. She paused. I think I asked him if he was family. He said no. I asked if he needed anything. He said no. He stood there for a while. I'd say 3 hours, close to it. And then when I came back out for a break, he was talking to the woman at the admissions desk. Arthur waited. Your personal effects, your wallet, your jacket. We'd listed you as a John Doe on intake because your ID wasn't immediately visible. When she found your name in the paperwork later that morning, she called out to me because there was a boy at the front desk asking if there was a way to know if the man was going to be okay. The woman at the desk said she couldn't share medical information, so she said, I know she did this. I saw her. She said she could leave him a note that would be passed to the patient if he wanted, and he wrote something. A pause. But you already know that, because he must have put it in your pocket before we loaded you. We found a blank space in the front pocket of your jacket in the records. There were 2 notes, Arthur said. He hadn't been sure of this until now. He asked her to pass a second one, Ruth confirmed, written on a piece of paper she gave him. I don't know what it said. I didn't read it, but he asked her to make sure you got it. Arthur was quiet. The desk attendant, she told me later, he also asked about the phone call, whether the ambulance had gotten there okay because of the call. She told him yes, the location information he'd given had been accurate. He nodded. And then she said she had a message from the billing office, that you had left a cash amount at the front desk, to be given to the person who had called the ambulance if they ever came in. $50, I think. She pushed the envelope across the counter. Ruth paused. He didn't take it. Well, the line was very quiet. He just said, "Is the old man going to be okay?" And she said we couldn't share that information. And he said, "Okay," and he left. Arthur sat with this for a long moment. Outside his study window, a spring afternoon was doing something gentle and indifferent with the light. "Thank you, Ruth," he said. "Of course," she said. "He was a good kid. I hope things worked out for him." "They are working out," Arthur said. "That's why I called." He hung up and sat in the quiet. He opened his desk drawer and took out the folder, the one with the note in it, the torn phone number, the scholarship records. He took out the note and held it. 4 years ago, a child had stood in a hospital waiting room for 3 hours, without being asked to, without being permitted to go in, without any information about whether the stranger he had helped was going to be okay. He had refused money. He had left a note through a desk attendant who he had no reason to believe would deliver it. And he had walked away. He had not expected to be watched. He had not expected to be found. He had not expected Arthur to come back. That was exactly why it mattered. Arthur stayed at the desk for a long time. He got up, finally, and went to the small cabinet on the far wall where he kept the estate files. His copies, the ones Sandra Park had sent him after he signed. He took out the folder and brought it back to the desk. He found the most recent version of the amendment, the one he'd signed in the early days of his hospital stay the previous week, the one that was already on file with Sandra's office. He had already signed it. He had already done what needed to be done. But he read it again, all the way through, slowly, looking at the language Sandra had helped him build. Careful, specific, unambiguous. And at the bottom, in the supplementary attachment section, there was the page he had asked to be included. Not a legal document, but a personal one, a letter, addressed to Marcus Antoine Webb, explaining in Arthur's own words what had happened on South Morgan Street, what he had found afterward, what he had understood too slowly, and why he had made the decisions he had made. The letter ended with a sentence he had written and rewritten several times before getting it right. "You didn't know I was watching. That's exactly why it mattered." He closed the folder and put it back. Then he heard the front door, and Margaret's voice saying something in the hallway, and then Derek's voice answering, and Arthur understood that Derek had come by unannounced, which he occasionally did when he was worried and didn't want to admit to being worried. He heard Derek's footsteps on the stairs. Purposeful. His son's footsteps had always been purposeful. That was not a quality Arthur had ever failed to admire, even when everything else between them was complicated. And then a knock at the study door. "Come in," Arthur said. Derek entered. He was wearing the cashmere coat that must have been on its 3rd or 4th year by now, and he looked tired in the way of people who sleep enough but think too much. He looked at Arthur at the desk and at the folder and at the general arrangement of things, and he seemed to know, immediately and with the precision of a man who had spent his whole life reading his father, that something had been decided. He sat down in the chair across from the desk without being asked. "You signed something," Derek said. Arthur looked at his son. At 49, Derek Vane looked enough like Arthur's memory of himself at that age to be disorienting. The same jaw, the same slight habit of holding the left shoulder higher than the right, the same quality of paying very close attention while appearing merely to be present. Whatever Arthur had given his son, he had given him those things. "I signed the estate amendment," Arthur said, "some months ago. It's on file with Sandra." Derek was very still. "And?" "The company holdings go to the trust, as they always have. You remain on the board. The Hyde Park house goes to you. The rest of the estate, the liquid assets, the private investments, the charitable endowments, a significant portion is reallocated." "To Marcus," Derek said. It was not a question. "To a trust in his name," Arthur said. "To be administered in stages, education, career, and at 25, the principal." He paused. "There are also provisions for Diane Webb's medical care, ongoing, through the health fund that has already been in place." The room was very quiet. Derek sat with this for a long time. Arthur watched him, watched the effort his son made to hold his face still while the thing underneath it moved, and felt, alongside the familiar sadness of this distance between them, something else. Something that might have been, if he had to name it, hope. Not for what Derek would do next, exactly, but for the conversation they might eventually have about why.
"You're leaving a substantial part of your estate to a boy you met on a street corner," Derek said. His voice was controlled in the way it got when the control was costing him something. "A young man," Arthur said, "who I've known for 7 years. Dad," Derek, Arthur met his son's eyes. "I know what you want to say. You can say it. I want you to." Derek looked at him. Something shifted in his face, the armor very slightly at the edges. "I don't understand why," Derek said. "I don't understand why it's him. I know the story. I know what he did. But I have spent—" He stopped, his jaw was tight. "I have spent my whole life trying to be what you needed. I ran the company when you couldn't. I made the Copenhagen deal when the board was falling apart and nobody else." "I know," Arthur said. "And this kid spends $2 at a payphone and gets half your estate." "That's not what happened," Arthur said quietly. "And I think you know that." Derek looked at the floor. His hands were in his lap and they were very still. "What happened," Arthur said, "is that you and I built something between us that was made of work and obligation and a kind of love that neither of us has ever been able to say out loud. And I am not taking that away. You are in this will, Derek. You are in this house and this board and everything I built in the first half of my life. But what I'm leaving Marcus is different. It is not a replacement for you. It is a recognition that—" He stopped. He started again. "I closed myself off for a long time. After your mother died, after the hospital, I decided that I knew how people were, and I used that knowledge to stay inside the walls I'd built. And I was wrong to do that. Marcus did not teach me that I was wrong. He just made it impossible to pretend I wasn't." Derek was quiet for a long time. He was looking at the desk. Not at Arthur, but at the desk, at the file folder, at the general space where things had been decided. "What about the note?" he said finally. Arthur looked at him. "Margaret told me about a note," Derek said. "Years ago. Something about a note you keep." Arthur opened the desk drawer. He took out the folder. He found the note and set it on the desk, facing Derek. Derek leaned forward. He read it. He was still for a moment after. Then he sat back. His face had changed, very slightly at the edges, in a way Arthur had not seen in a long time. It was, Arthur thought, the look of someone who is deciding whether to let themselves feel something they've been holding at arm's length for quite a while. Derek said nothing. He stood up, slowly, and buttoned his cashmere coat and walked to the door. He stopped there with his hand on the frame. He did not turn around. But his voice, when it came, was different. Not controlled, not careful, just his voice. "I'll see you Sunday, Dad," he said, and then he left. His footsteps went down the stairs and the front door opened and closed with its usual sound, and Arthur sat in the quiet of his study, with the notes still on the desk between him and where his son had been sitting. The fire in Derek Vane's eyes, the thing Arthur had seen when Derek found him signing papers in the hospital room, had not gone out. But it had, for a moment, been something other than anger. Arthur filed that carefully, in the part of himself that was still watching, still patient, still not entirely sure of what the future held, but more willing than he had been in a long time to wait and see. The paper in the will. The room on LaSalle Street. Arthur Harlow Vane died on a Wednesday morning in November, 3 months after his 79th birthday, in his own bed in the Hyde Park house, with Margaret downstairs making Tuesday soup a day late because she had not gotten around to it on Tuesday, and with the window cracked slightly so that the November air came through in the particular way Eleanor had always liked it to. He had been declining for 6 weeks, with the slow, specific deterioration of a body that has done its work and is settling its accounts. He had not been in pain, the doctors said, not in the final days. He had been, by all accounts, at peace. Marcus found out from Davis,
who called him at 7:43 in the morning at his dormitory at the University of Illinois, where Marcus was in his first semester of civil engineering. He sat on the edge of his bed in his small dorm room and held the phone after the call ended and stayed there for a long time, looking at the grey November light coming through the window. He called his mother. She picked up on the second ring, as though she had been waiting.
"I know," she said.
"Davis called me too." They were quiet together on the line for a moment, the quiet of two people who have lost someone and are sitting with the specific weight of it, neither of them in any rush to say the thing that cannot cover the distance. "He was a good man," Diane Webb said. "Yeah," Marcus said. His voice was level. He had learned, over 19 years, to hold difficult things level while he figured out what to do with them. He really was. He did not go back to class that day. The reading of the will was scheduled for 2 weeks after the funeral, which was a small, private service in Hyde Park that Marcus attended with his mother and his Aunt Clara, sitting in the second row behind Margaret and Davis and a collection of Arthur's oldest associates, men in their 70s and 80s, who moved with the careful deliberateness of people who know they are at the age where such services recur with increasing frequency. Derek Vane sat in the front row alone in his cashmere coat, a new one. Arthur's death had granted him the right to upgrade, and stared at the photograph of his father on the program with an expression that was too complex and too interior to read from 3 rows back. The office of Park and Associates Attorneys at Law on LaSalle Street had a conference room that tried, with moderate success, to feel warmer than it was. Sandra Park sat at the head of the table in a charcoal blazer, her reading glasses on, her documents organized with the geometry of a person who is never not prepared. Derek sat on one side of the long table with his attorney, a man named Rourke, whom Marcus had not met before but whose presence, the slight forward lean, the pen already uncapped, communicated his purpose efficiently. Marcus sat on the other side with his mother, who had taken the train in from Pilsen and was wearing the navy blazer she saved for events that required it. Davis sat near the door, quietly. Margaret was not there. She had said she didn't need to be, and had instead made a casserole for Marcus and Diane and left it on their doorstep in Pilsen with a card that said, simply, "He was very proud of you." Sandra Park read the will in the clear, unhurried diction of a professional who has done this many times and understands that the clarity of language is an act of care. The house in Hyde Park went to Derek, as Arthur had told him it would. The board position, the trust structure for the company holdings, these were as arranged. Derek listened to this section with a neutrality that was either relief or the practice performance of it. Then Sandra read the amendment. She read it clearly and completely. And when she finished, the room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when something large has been said. Derek's attorney, Rourke, leaned in and murmured something. Derek was looking at the table. His face was doing what his face had been doing on the night in the study 7 months ago. The armor shifting at the edges. Then he looked up. "I'd like to contest this," Derek said. His voice was controlled. "On grounds of undue influence, my father was, in his later years, his relationship with Mr. Webb was, in my view, disproportionate in a way that—" "Mr. Vane," Sandra said, in a tone that was courteous and implacable, "I'd encourage you to speak with Mr. Rourke privately before making that statement on the record. But I'll say this. The amendment was executed 18 months ago, reviewed and reconfirmed in writing 6 months ago during your father's hospital stay, witnessed by 2 independent parties, and accompanied by a capacity assessment conducted by a physician at your father's request. Your father anticipated this response." Rourke put his hand on Derek's arm. Derek did not look at Rourke. He looked at Marcus. Marcus had been looking at the table. He looked up now and met Derek's eyes across the long expanse of polished wood, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. The son and the boy, the heir and the choice. The 2 things Arthur Vane had loved in his last years with the same heart and in different ways. Marcus said, "I don't want your house. I don't want your board seat. I don't want any of the things that were yours." His voice was quiet and even. "What your father left me, I didn't ask for it. I didn't know the full amount until today. What I knew was that he showed up to a school ceremony in a plastic chair when nobody else could come, and he talked to me on Thursdays for 7 years, and he told me to take my medication, and I told him to take his. He stopped. I know you think this was about money. It wasn't about money for him. I don't know if that helps you, but it's true. The room was very quiet. Derek looked at him. Something was moving in his face. The thing underneath, the thing that had been pressing against the edges of the controlled exterior for months, maybe longer. His jaw was tight. His eyes were too bright, briefly, in the way of someone who is winning a battle they have decided they must not lose. Then Rourke said something quietly again. Derek looked at him. He looked back at Marcus. He looked at Sandra.
He started. Stopped. I'll speak with Rourke. He stood and his chair scraped, and he went to the corner of the room with his attorney and spoke in a low voice that the room was not quite small enough to hear. Marcus turned back to the table. His mother's hand was on his arm, warm and steady. He put his hand over hers. Sandra Park looked at both of them across the table with the expression of a woman who has seen many rooms like this one, and who knows which outcomes tend to last. 20 minutes later, Derek and Rourke returned. Rourke sat down and began to make notes. Derek remained standing. "I'm not going to contest it," Derek said. His voice was different than it had been when he sat down. Not soft exactly, but something had gone out of the control, the way a fist goes when the hand decides it doesn't need to be a fist anymore. "I want to say something, though, off the record." He looked at Sandra. "Of course," she said. Derek looked at Marcus again. "My father," he stopped, started again. "My father told me once that you did something for him before he ever found you, that you left a note. He never told me what it said exactly." He paused. "He kept it in his wallet. I found it when we were going through his things. After." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and brought out a small piece of paper, folded in the careful way of something that has been folded and refolded many times. He set it on the table, pushed it gently in Marcus's direction. "I thought you should have it back," he said. Marcus looked at the piece of paper. He didn't pick it up immediately. He looked at it for a moment. This piece of paper that he had written at 11 years old, in the careful, slightly too large print of a child who has learned to write earnestly, and folded and placed in a stranger's pocket on a cold October morning, without expecting anything to come of it. He picked it up. He didn't unfold it, he held it. "Thank you," he said to Derek. Derek nodded. He put his hands in his coat pockets. He stood there for another moment, looking at the table, and then he said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "He was proud of you. He said it every time I talked to him." A pause. "Just so you know." Then he picked up his briefcase and left the room with Rourke, and his footsteps went down the hallway, and the elevator opened and closed, and the room was left with its quiet. The letter. Sandra Park stayed in the conference room with Marcus and Diane, while Davis went down to get the car, and she opened the file she had kept separate from the main estate documents. The sealed envelope Arthur had prepared 14 months ago and instructed her to deliver directly, not read into the record, not summarized. The envelope had Marcus's full name on it in Arthur's handwriting. The same handwriting Marcus had seen on birthday cards. Arthur had sent birthday cards, always a week early and always with a 3-sentence note about something specific. And on the message, written on the back of a math textbook, Arthur had left for him on his 17th birthday, which said, "For the questions in the margins, keep asking them." He opened the envelope at the table with his mother beside him. He took out the letter. 3 pages, handwritten, in the careful but slightly less steady script of a man in his late 70s who is still in the habit of using a fountain pen. He read it slowly. He did not read it aloud. But here is what it said in substance. It began with South Morgan Street, with the account of that Tuesday morning from Arthur's side. The pavement, the cold, the 7 minutes of no one stopping,
and then the sound of a bicycle with a skipping chain. Arthur had written about the note honestly. He had found it on the stretcher. He had read it twice. He had folded it back exactly as it was and put it in his pocket. And he had understood, in the back of the ambulance, that something had been given to him that he did not know what to do with yet. The letter described what came after. Davis's report, the list of facts about Marcus's life, the detail about the $2 at the payphone. It described the Thursday at the Blue Anchor and the math competition ceremony and the years of conversations and the scholarship that Arthur had maneuvered so carefully and for so long refused to take credit for. It described the call with Ruth Esparza, the nurse, and what Ruth had told him, and what Arthur had understood when she told him, that Marcus had stood in a hospital waiting room for 3 hours without being asked to, without being let in, without any information about whether the stranger he had helped was going to be okay, that he had refused the money, that he had left a second note through a desk attendant. The letter said, "I spent my whole adult life believing that the world was a transaction, that everyone who ever helped me was reaching for something I had. I built walls because I thought walls were wisdom. I tested people because I thought testing them was intelligence. And I was partly right, in the way people are partly right about the worst lessons they've learned. But I was also wrong. I was wrong in the specific way of a man who mistakes the exception for proof of the rule. You were the exception. Not because you were perfect. You were 11 and stubborn and suspicious of strangers, which are appropriate qualities at 11. But because you stood in a waiting room for 3 hours for someone you had no reason to care about, and then went back to your bicycle and your newspapers, and you didn't tell anyone. You didn't expect to be found. You thought the story was over. It wasn't over. What I'm leaving you is not a reward. It's not a transaction. I want you to understand that. It is the acknowledgement of something I should have known how to say out loud, years ago in a diner over coffee. That the world is worth trusting, sometimes, in specific people who show you by the things they do when no one is watching. You didn't know I was watching. That's exactly why it mattered. Take care of your mother. Take care of the people you can. Build things, bridges, buildings, whatever it turns out to be, that hold weight for the people who need to cross them. That's all I want. Arthur Marcus read the last page and then sat with the letter in his hands for a long time. The conference room was quiet. The November light came through the window at the angle particular to late afternoon in Chicago, slanted with the specific melancholy of a season ending. His mother sat beside him without saying anything, her hand on his arm, warm and steady as she had always been. He folded the letter. He put it back in the envelope. He put the small piece of paper, the note, the original one, in his own 11-year-old handwriting, in the envelope with it. He held the envelope in both hands for a moment. Then he said, "Mom." "Yeah," she said. "I'm okay," he said. "I know," she said. "You always are." This wasn't entirely true, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so, because some truths are not the point. The point was that they were there, in a room on LaSalle Street in November, and the man who had sat across a diner table from Marcus for 7 years had made sure, in the careful, methodical way he did everything that mattered, that Marcus would be all right. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was the kind of more that a person does not know how to measure, and so simply carries. South Morgan Street, 8 years later. The city had changed the block. Not dramatically. Southside neighborhoods change in the specific way of places that have seen too many promises to trust rapid transformation. But the diner on the corner had a new awning, and the payphone was gone, removed at some point in the intervening years and replaced with a municipal recycling bin. The sidewalk had been repaired in patches, the new concrete a lighter grey than the old, so that the block wore its history and colour, dark and light, old and mended. Marcus Webb, 27 years old, PE after his name now, a civil engineering licence he had framed and hung in his office at the infrastructure firm on Vaca Drive, where he had been working for 2 years. stood on that sidewalk on an October Tuesday morning with his son. The boy's name was James Arthur Webb. He was 3 years old. He had his grandfather's name as his middle name and his great-grandfather's first name as his first, which was a choice Marcus had made quietly and kept to himself until the birth certificate was filed. He had his mother's eyes, Marcus's wife, Priya, who was at the office this morning and had kissed both of them at the door and told Marcus not to make the boy late for preschool, though preschool did not start for another 2 hours. James Arthur had a red coat and a tendency to crouch down and look at things very close to the ground, with the same quality of focused attention Marcus had once used to look at bicycle gears. He was currently crouching next to a crack in the sidewalk, investigating. "James," Marcus said, "come here a second." The boy looked up, then stood and came to stand beside his father. He was 3, which meant he came up roughly to Marcus's knee, and he looked at the block with the open, unfiltered attention of someone for whom every surface still has the possibility of being remarkable. "This is a place I want to tell you about," Marcus said. "Okay," James said, which was what he said to most propositions, being at an age where agreement was the efficient path. "A long time ago," Marcus said, "before you were born, I was coming to work right here. I was selling newspapers on this block, and I saw an old man fall down on the sidewalk." James looked at the sidewalk as if searching for evidence of the event. "Was he okay?" James asked. "He was okay," Marcus said. "But I didn't know that then, so I stopped. I called the ambulance from the phone that used to be right there." He pointed at the recycling bin. "And I waited with him until they came." James nodded. This was, apparently, the correct behavior, and he had no notes. "And then, a little while later," Marcus said, "the man came to find me, to say thank you, and we became—" He stopped. He thought about how to say this to a 3-year-old. "We became friends. For a long time. He was my friend, until he died." James looked up at his father. "Was he old when he died?" "Very old," Marcus said. 79. James considered this number, which was beyond his current sense of scale. "That's very old," he said gravely. "It is," Marcus agreed. They stood there for a moment. A bus went by. 2 pigeons relocated and then relocated back. The city made its ordinary Tuesday sounds, the same sounds it had been making for as long as there had been a city here to make them. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket. He had put it there this morning deliberately, before they left the apartment. The envelope, thin now from being opened many times over 8 years, worn at the corners. He took out from inside the envelope the piece of paper. Not the letter. The letter was framed on the wall in his office on Wacker Drive, Sandra Park's copy, the one Arthur had given her for safekeeping alongside the will. This was the original, the note. He unfolded it carefully. He had read it so many times that the paper had developed the soft, slightly yielding quality of things that have been handled with consistent care over years. The pencil was very faded now, but readable. He held it at an angle for the light. James looked at the paper with interest. "What does it say?" Marcus read it to him. "I hope you feel better, mister. Nobody should be alone on the ground." James looked at the paper. Then he looked at his father. Then he looked at the sidewalk, the specific square of it where, 27 years ago, in a story James only knew as a story, the event had begun. "Did you write that?" he asked. "Yeah," Marcus said. "When I was 11. "Why?" Marcus looked at the note, at the careful, slightly too large handwriting of a boy who had learned to write earnestly and practiced it without being asked to, and thought about how to answer a 3-year-old's version of a question that didn't have a simple answer. "Because," he said finally, "it was the right thing to say." James nodded. This satisfied him. He reached up and took Marcus's hand, small, warm, the grip of a child who has no reason not to trust the hand they're reaching for. And they stood together on South Morgan Street in the October morning light. Later that day, Marcus would go back to his office and look at Arthur's letter on the wall and think, as he did sometimes, about the specific shape of what Arthur had built. Not the freight empire, not the estate, not the trust that had paid for Marcus's education and given him the starting margin that made the rest possible. He would think about the plastic chair in the back of a classroom, and a cup of coffee with 3 sugars, and a nod across a diner table, and the particular quality of showing up, consistently, without being asked to, for 7 years. He would think about the difference between a transaction and a gift, and about how long it had taken him to understand that what Arthur had given him in the years before the will was already the largest thing. But that was later. Right now, on South Morgan Street, he folded the note with the same careful fold it had always had, put it back in the envelope, put the envelope in his jacket pocket, close to his chest. He looked down at his son. "Ready?" he said. "Ready," said James Arthur Webb. And they walked on. Some things don't announce themselves. A folded piece of paper in a dead man's wallet. A boy standing in a hospital waiting room for 3 hours with nowhere to be. A man in a plastic chair in the back of a classroom who drove 40 minutes to watch a certificate ceremony. The things that shape us are rarely the ones that felt significant when they happened. They tend to feel small, an ordinary Tuesday, a bicycle with a skipping chain, $2 in a pocket at exactly the right moment. Arthur Vane understood this by the end of his life, and Marcus Webb had understood it since he was 11, even if he hadn't had the words for it yet. The world is not primarily a transaction. That's not what experience tells us. That's what we decide to believe when the transactions have hurt us enough. Arthur came back from that decision. It cost him years to do it, but he came back. And that, I think, is the real inheritance. Not the trust, not the estate, not the letter on the wall. It's the simple, hard-earned knowledge that it's worth coming back. Thank you for spending this time with Arthur and Marcus's story. If it touched something in you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. New stories every week. Until next time, take care of each other out there.